Blood always smells like rusted pennies and bad decisions. Abigail scrubbed it from her cuticles, watching the pink foam spiral down the drain. She had spent 5 years burying her past under cheap scrubs and silence. Then heavy combat boots echoed in the triage hall. They had found her. Linoleum floors do not forgive. By hour 10 of a 12-hour night shift at St. Jude's Memorial, the hard plastic tiles feel less like a floor and more like a meat tenderizer working against the soles of your feet. Abigail Cole shifted her weight, ignoring the dull, rhythmic throbbing in her lower back. She leaned against the nurse's station, a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee resting against her palm. The coffee tasted like burnt copper and regret, but she drank it anyway. It was 3:14 a.m., the witching hour. The emergency room was a purgatory of fluorescent lighting and bad luck. To her left, a drunk undergrad was audibly vomiting into a plastic basin, the sour stench of cheap tequila and stomach acid cutting through the overpowering ambient smell of industrial bleach. To her right, a monitor beeped with a steady, obnoxious rhythm, tethered to an elderly man dreaming through a morphine drip. Abigail was good at this, not just the nursing, though she was impeccable at starting an IV on a rolling vein, but the art of being invisible. She spoke softly. She kept her head down. Her hair, a nondescript shade of ash blonde, was always pulled into a severe utilitarian bun. She wore scrubs a size too large to obscure the jagged, puckered shrapnel scar that chewed through her left shoulder down to her ribs. When the arrogant, sleep-deprived residents barked orders, she simply nodded. She never argued. She never showed them up. She was just Abigail. Soft-spoken, deeply boring, reliable Abigail. The heavy automatic doors at the ambulance bay slid open with a violent mechanical hiss. John Doe, mid-30s, a paramedic yelled, his boots squeaking wildly on the linoleum as he and his partner shoved the gurney through the doors. Found in an alley off 4th, multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen, BP is tanking, 70/40, pulse is thready. The mundane hum of the ER shattered. Nurses swarmed. Dr. Weber, a second-year resident who still wore too much cologne, rushed to the head of the bed, snapping on purple nitrile gloves. On my count, Weber ordered, his voice cracking slightly. 1, 2, 3, transfer.
They hoisted the bleeding man onto the trauma bed. The stench hit Abigail instantly. It wasn't just blood. It was the sharp, acrid bite of gunpowder, the distinct smell of perforated bowel, and the metallic tang of tearing flesh. Her nostrils flared. For a fraction of a second, the fluorescent lights of St. Jude's flickered out, replaced by the blinding, dust-choked sun of a Syrian tarmac. She heard the deafening chop of Black Hawk rotors. She tasted sand. She blinked hard. Focus. He's tachycardic, a nurse shouted over the din. Heart rate 140. Breath sounds are absent on the right, Weber said, pressing his stethoscope to the man's bloody chest. He looked up, his eyes wide and panicked behind his plastic face shield. Trachea is deviating. He's got a tension pneumothorax. I need a chest tube set up now. Chest tube takes too long. He's crashing, Abigail said softly. Weber glared at her. I am the doctor here, Cole. Get the tray. The monitor let out a high-pitched, continuous wail. The patient's back arched, his lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. He was drowning in his own air, the pressure building in his chest cavity, crushing his heart. Abigail didn't think. The carefully constructed dam holding back 5 years of suppressed muscle memory completely collapsed. She didn't grab the chest tube tray. Instead, her hand shot to the crash cart, her fingers wrapping around a 14-gauge needle. She moved with a fluid, terrifying economy of motion. There was no hesitation, no shaking, just cold, absolute precision. Before Weber could even open his mouth to scream at her, Abigail stepped into his space. She found the second intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line on the patient's right chest, solely by touch, her thumb pressing hard into the slippery, blood-slicked skin. She drove the needle in. There was a distinct pop as it punctured the pleural space, followed immediately by a sharp, violent hiss of escaping air. The blood trapped in the catheter bubbled outward. Instantly, the high-pitched wail of the monitor broke, dropping back into a rapid but stable rhythm. The patient's chest fell in a deep, desperate exhalation. His color began to return. Silence blanketed the trauma bay. The only sound was the hiss of the oxygen and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Weber stared at her, his mouth slightly open. The other nurses were frozen, their hands hovering over bandage wrappers.
Abigail stared at the needle protruding from the man's chest, then looked down at her own hands. They were covered in blood. Her pulse was hammering in her ears, not with fear, but with the familiar, intoxicating adrenaline she had spent half a decade trying to sweat out. She felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over her. She had slipped. She immediately stepped back, shrinking her shoulders, lowering her chin, desperate to become small again. She wiped her bloody hands on her scrub pants. I just saw it on a medical show once, Abigail stammered, her voice trembling, forcing a look of wide-eyed shock onto her face. I'm sorry, doctor. I panicked. You can place the chest tube now. Weber blinked, shaking off the shock. His ego quickly filled the vacuum left by her retreat. Right. Yes. Reckless, Cole. Unbelievably reckless, but lucky. Get out of my way. Abigail backed out of the trauma bay, slipping through the glass doors. She practically ran to the staff locker room, pushing through the swinging door and collapsing against a row of dented metal lockers. She slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. Her hands were shaking violently now. The aftermath. It was always the aftermath that got her. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the ghost pains in her shoulder. You're dead, she reminded herself, whispering the words into the dark, empty room. You died in a burning Humvee outside Raqqa. You are a ghost. Ghosts don't save people. Ghosts don't exist. She sat there on the cold tile, smelling the copper on her cuticles, waiting for the shaking to stop. By 4:45 a.m., the ER had settled into a quiet, exhausted lull. The gunshot victim was stabilized and upstairs in surgery. The drunk college kid had been discharged with a bucket and a hefty bill. The waiting room was mostly empty, save for a man sleeping under a plastic fern and a mother rocking a feverish toddler in the corner. Abigail stood at the triage desk, hiding behind a towering stack of discharge paperwork. She felt hollowed out. The adrenaline dump from the trauma bay had left her physically drained. Her joints ached, and she had a dull, persistent headache throbbing right behind her left eye. She just wanted to clock out, go back to her cramped one-bedroom apartment, and stare at the ceiling fan until she passed out. The automatic sliding doors at the front entrance parted. It wasn't the manic hiss of an ambulance arrival. It was a slow, deliberate opening.
Abigail didn't look up immediately. She heard them first. Footsteps, heavy, synchronized, but deliberately muffled. These weren't the shuffling steps of sick patients or the chaotic stomping of panicked families. It was the sound of Verum soles rolling heel to toe on the wet linoleum. It was the sound of men who knew how to walk quietly in heavy gear. The smell hit her a second later. It cut through the hospital bleach like a straight razor. It was a scent profile she hadn't encountered in 5 years, yet it was permanently hardwired into the deepest, most primal centers of her brain. Wet wool, unwashed canvas, the metallic tang of gun oil, stale airplane cabin air, and beneath it all, the sharp, feral musk of men who had been awake for 3 days straight, living on stimulants and stress. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Her lungs simply stopped working. She slowly raised her eyes over the top of the computer monitor. There were 4 of them. They stood just inside the sliding doors, letting the sensors close the glass behind them. They didn't look like soldiers from a recruitment poster. They looked like roughnecks, contractors. They wore scuffed work boots, faded denim, and dark weather-beaten jackets that bulked slightly around the waistlines, concealing sidearms. They had beards of varying lengths, and their eyes were sunken and shadowed with exhaustion. But it was the way they moved that gave them away. They didn't aimlessly wander toward the desk. They immediately fanned out, their eyes scanning the room in rapid, methodical grits. Exits, blind spots, threats. They cleared the room visually in less than 2 seconds. Abigail's stomach dropped. The nausea returned, violent and sudden. She recognized the man on the far left, Miller. He had a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a scar she had stitched shut under the light of a chemical flare in a bombed-out basement in Fallujah. Next to him was Wyatt, broader, heavier, leaning slightly on his right leg due to a shattered femur he refused to let fully heal. And in the center, Callahan, her team leader, the man who had signed her death certificate, the man who had supposedly watched her burn. Abigail's reaction wasn't heroic. She didn't feel a surge of badass defiance. She felt the desperate, ugly panic of a cornered animal. Her hands instantly went slick with sweat, the paperwork slipping from her grip and scattering across the linoleum floor. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she
thought it might break them. Run. The thought wasn't rational. It was pure instinct. The loading dock was 80 feet down the left corridor. If she bolted now, she could hit the emergency exit bar, trigger the alarm, and lose herself in the maze of alleyways behind the hospital before they even processed what happened. She took a half step backward, her hip bumping hard against the rolling desk chair. The sound was tiny, just a brief squeak of plastic wheels, but in the quiet, Eritan snapped toward the triage desk. For a terrible, stretched-out second, their eyes met across 30 feet of sterile hospital flooring. Abigail stopped breathing. She prayed to a God she didn't believe in that the oversized scrubs, the severe bun, the pallor of 5 years under fluorescent lights had changed her enough. She prayed he would see just another exhausted, soft-spoken nurse. Callahan stared at her. His face, weathered and lined with 1,000 unspoken horrors, didn't register shock. It didn't register anger. It just went completely, terrifyingly blank. He raised his hand, a sharp, subtle gesture, and the 3 men beside him stopped moving instantly. Abigail's flight response took over. She abandoned the desk, turning sharply toward the back hallway. Her Crocs squeaked frantically on the floor. She pushed through the swinging double doors leading to the supply wing, her chest heaving, oxygen burning her lungs. She heard the heavy footsteps behind her. They weren't running. They didn't need to. They were just closing the distance, inevitable and relentless. She rounded the corner toward the loading dock, her hand reaching out for the red crash bar of the emergency exit. Just 10 feet, 5 feet. A heavy, calloused hand clamped down on her shoulder, right over the thickest part of her shrapnel scar. Abigail cried out, twisting violently. Muscle memory, lethal and fast, kicked in. She dropped her center of gravity, pivoting to drive her elbow backward toward her attacker's throat, her other hand reaching for a scalpel she no longer carried in her pocket. Callahan caught her elbow mid-strike with his free hand. He didn't force her down. He just absorbed the blow.
Callahan released her arm and took a step back, raising both his hands open at shoulder height to show he wasn't a threat. He looked at her, really looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the lines of exhaustion and terror on her face. The other 3 men rounded the corner, filling the narrow hallway. They stopped dead, staring at her as if looking at an apparition. Miller let out a shaky, strangled exhale. Wyatt just stared, his jaw muscles clenching. Silence hung thick in the air, heavy with the smell of wet wool and hospital antiseptic. Callahan slowly lowered his hands. He looked at the oversized scrubs, the trembling hands, the terror in her eyes. "Jesus Christ, Doc," Callahan whispered, his voice gravelly, cracking under the weight of an emotion Abigail had never seen him show. "You really are a ghost." Abigail pressed herself harder against the wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "I don't know who you think I am," she lied, her voice shaking. "You need to leave. I'll call security." Callahan didn't move. He reached into his heavy jacket. Abigail tensed, ready to fight, ready to die again. But he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a crumpled, blood-stained piece of olive-drab canvas. It was a tactical medic's patch, the edges charred and blackened by fire. Her patch, the one she had torn off her vest and shoved into his hands right before the roof collapsed in Raqqa. He held it out to her. "Security can't help you, Wraith," Callahan said softly, using her old call sign. The word felt like a physical blow to her stomach. "We didn't come here to drag you back, and we didn't come here to hurt you." He swallowed hard, the tough, unbreakable Tier 1 operator suddenly looking incredibly fragile under the harsh hospital lights. "We came to say thank you." Dust crusted the frayed edges of the olive-drab canvas. It wasn't ordinary hospital dust, but fine, granular Syrian sand, permanently ground into the fibers, baked in by a fire that was supposed to have incinerated her. Abigail stared at the scrap of fabric resting in Callahan's calloused palm. Her lungs flatly refused to expand. Above them, a single fluorescent bulb emitted a faint, high-pitched hum, a sound that drilled directly into the space behind her eyes. She didn't reach for the patch. She pressed her spine harder against the painted cinderblock wall, relishing the biting cold seeping through her thin cotton scrubs. It was a grounding sensation.
Cold meant she was alive. Cold meant she was here, in Ohio, in a sterile supply corridor, and not bleeding out on a shattered concrete floor 6,000 miles away. "You shouldn't be here," Abigail whispered. Her voice lacked the soft, accommodating lilt she used with arrogant doctors and terrified patients. It was flat, dead, a voice built for radio chatter under heavy fire. Callahan didn't flinch. He kept his hand extended. "Took us 3 years to even believe the intel, Wraith. Another 2 to bypass the DoD flags to find the exact hospital. You left a ghost in the machine, a mandatory federal background check for your nursing license renewal, a partial thumbprint that snagged on an old NSA subroutine before a buddy of mine scrubbed it. Then you should have left it scrubbed." Her fingers curled into tight fists against the wall. The nausea was receding, replaced by a slow, venomous anger. It burned hot in her chest, a familiar, ugly fuel. "I am dead, Callahan. You signed the paperwork. You stood in front of my empty casket at Arlington and handed a folded flag to a fake ant the agency invented. I burned my entire life down so I wouldn't have to look over my shoulder, and you just walked through the front doors of my hospital. We walked in quietly. Miller spoke up from the back of the hallway. Abigail's eyes darted to him. Miller, the door kicker, the joker. He didn't look funny anymore. His face was gaunt, the skin around his eyes bruised purple from chronic insomnia. He smelled faintly of stale chewing tobacco and peppermint oil, a pathetic attempt to mask the undeniable stench of hard liquor sweating through his paws. Quietly, Abigail scoffed, a bitter, broken sound. You four of cordite and misery. You carry the war on you like a cheap cologne. Any cop with a brain would make you in 10 seconds. We're private now, Wyatt rumbled. His voice was a deep, growly bass that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. He shifted his weight off his bad leg. The faint mechanical click of a customized knee brace echoed in the narrow corridor. Contract work, logistics. We don't kick doors anymore. Doc, I don't care what you do, Abigail snapped, pushing herself off the wall. She paced a tight, agitated circle in the small space between the supply carts and the men blocking her exit. Her Crocs squeaked, a ridiculous, infantile sound that completely ruined her intimidation factor. She hated it. She hated these cheap shoes. She hated the oversized scrubs.
She hated that they were looking at her like she was a phantom. "Why are you here, Callahan?" she demanded, stopping directly in front of him. She was 5'6", dwarfed by his massive frame, but she didn't look up. She stared dead center at his sternum, right where his ceramic plates used to sit. "You didn't breach international protocols and hack federal databases just to drop off a souvenir? Operators don't do nostalgia. You want something." Callahan slowly lowered his hand, his fingers curling around the chart patch. He looked down at her, and the absolute exhaustion in his face made him look 10 years older than his 42 years. "We want to sleep, Abigail," Callahan said. Hearing her real name, her given name, hit her harder than her call sign. She flinched, the muscle in her jaw jumping. "You think you're the only one who died in Raqqa?" Callahan's voice dropped to a harsh, ragged whisper. He stepped closer, entering her personal space, forcing her to look up into his dark, bloodshot eyes. "I gave the order to pull back. I dragged Miller out by his plate carrier. I watched the roof cave in on the triage point. I watched the fire eat the building. We spent 5 years thinking we left you to burn." He gestured blindly behind him to the other men. "Miller hasn't slept more than 2 hours a night since. Wyatt almost ate a hollow point bullet in a motel room in El Paso last year because the guilt was chewing through his brainstem. I drink until I pass out, and when I wake up, I still smell your flesh burning." Abigail stared at him, her chest tightening until she had to swallow a mouthful of dry air just to breathe. The anger, that hot protective armor she had thrown on a moment ago, began to crack. "We didn't come to recruit you," Callahan continued, his voice breaking slightly. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick throat. "We didn't come to blow your cover. We're leaving on a transport plane out of Wright-Patterson in 3 hours. We are never coming back to Ohio." He reached out, his movements agonizingly slow, telegraphing his intentions so she wouldn't react. He gently took her trembling, blood-stained hand and pressed the rough, charred patch into her palm. "We just needed to know you made it out," Callahan whispered, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "We needed to know that the best medic in the teams was still putting oxygen into lungs. That's it, Wraith. Just thank you." The heavy, suffocating silence of the hospital.
Corridor pressed in on them. The faint, rhythmic beeping of an IV pump echoed from somewhere far down the surgical wing. Abigail looked down at her hand. The patch felt incredibly heavy, as if the threads were woven from lead and coagulated blood. The edges were stiff, melted by extreme heat. She ran her thumb over the scorched fabric, feeling the raised, tactile embroidery of the medic cross. It was perfectly preserved in the center of the ruin. A single violent tremor worked its way up her arm. She clamped her jaw shut, desperately fighting the hot, humiliating sting of tears threatening to spill over her lower lashes. She was a ghost. Ghosts didn't cry. Wyatt stepped forward, limping past Callahan.
He didn't say a word. He just reached out and wrapped his massive, heavily scarred arms around her shoulders. Abigail froze, her muscles instantly locked up, instinctively preparing for a strike, a takedown, a fight. But Wyatt just held her. He smelled like leather, rain, and old grief. The sheer, overwhelming humanity of the gesture shattered the last remnants of the wall she had spent 5 years building. She let out a ragged, ugly gasp. Her forehead dropped against Wyatt's chest, her hands coming up to grip the tough fabric of his jacket. She didn't sob, but her shoulders shook violently, releasing half a decade of suppressed terror, isolation, and survivor's guilt in silent, agonizing waves. Miller stepped in next, resting a heavy, warm hand on her back, right over her shrapnel scar. He didn't pat her. He just left it there, a steady physical weight anchoring her to the linoleum floor. Callahan stood a foot away, watching his broken team finally find a fracture of peace in a fluorescent-lit hospital hallway. They stayed like that for a long minute. No one spoke. Words were useless currency for people who had communicated exclusively through suppressing fire, tourniquets, and body bags. The shared silence was a tourniquet for a different kind of wound. Eventually, Abigail stepped back. She wiped her nose with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint smear of dried blood from the trauma bay across her cheek. She didn't bother wiping it off. Wyatt gave her a stiff nod, his eyes suspiciously bright, before stepping back. Miller offered a weak, crooked smile, the first genuine expression she had seen on his face all night. "Keep your head down, Doc," Miller rasped, clearing his throat. "You too, you idiot," Abigail replied, her voice thick and gravelly. "Stop drinking peppermint oil. It doesn't hide the whiskey. It just makes you smell like a drunk candy cane." Miller let out a short, surprised bark of laughter. Noted. Callahan looked at her one last time. He didn't offer a salute. He didn't offer a hug. He just gave her a long, incredibly tired look of absolute respect. "Live a good life, Abigail," Callahan said. "I'm trying," she whispered. Callahan turned on his heel. "Let's go, boys. Wheels up in 3. They didn't walk back through the main ER. Callahan pushed the heavy metal crash bar on the loading dock doors. The alarm had been manually disabled. Miller's doing on their way in. The doors swung open, letting in a rush of freezing, damp autumn air. It smelled of wet asphalt, diesel exhaust, and rain. Abigail watched them walk out into the darkness. Their heavy boots crunched against the gravel of the alleyway, fading quickly into the ambient noise of the sleeping city. The metal doors swung shut with a heavy, final clank, sealing her back inside the sterile, bright purgatory of St. Jude's. She stood alone in the hallway for a long time. She looked down at the patch in her hand. Then she reached into the oversized pocket of her scrub top and shoved it deep down, past the alcohol swabs and rolls of medical tape. It rested heavily against her hip. Abigail walked over to the stainless steel scrub sink against the wall. She turned the water on hot. She pumped a generous dollop of harsh antibacterial soap into her hands and began to scrub. She watched the pink, diluted blood from the gunshot victim swirl down the drain, just as she had an hour ago. But this time she didn't feel the frantic, gnawing urge to disappear. She didn't feel the ghost pains in her shoulder. She dried her hands on a rough paper towel. She looked up at her reflection in the small, scratched metal mirror bolted above the sink. Her hair was still a mess. Her face was pale, shadowed with exhaustion. But as she reached up and pulled the severe, tight bun from her hair, letting the ash-blonde strands fall loose around her shoulders, her reflection seemed to sharpen. She didn't look like an invisible woman anymore. She looked like someone who had walked through the fire and finally realized she hadn't burned to ash. The overhead intercom crackled to life, breaking the silence. Code Yellow, Trauma Bay 2, ETA 3 minutes, MVC, multiple victims. Abigail Cole took a deep breath. The hospital air smelled like bleach, iodine, and fresh linens. It didn't smell like war. It smelled like work. She turned away from the mirror and walked briskly back toward the flashing lights of the emergency room, her footsteps steady and grounded on the linoleum floor. The ghosts of Abigail's past didn't come to haunt her. They came to set her free. Did this emotional reunion give you chills, or were you expecting a firefight in the ER? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. If you loved this deeply grounded, gritty medical drama, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and
Hit subscribe.
Stay tuned to our channel for more pulse-pounding, sensory-rich stories that blur the line between hiding and surviving.